The Nurse Theorists, Portraits of Excellence, Volume 2. In this edition, we feature Dr. Patricia Benner.
I was born in August 1942 in Hampton, Virginia, just after the United States entered World War II. My parents, Shirley and Clint Sawyer, had moved from North Carolina to Virginia in order for my father to work in the shipyard, building ships. My sister Luann was 2.5 years old when I was born. She is an influential older sister who was my most constant playmate in childhood and my very close adult friend. My youngest sister, June, completed our family when she was born in January 1952. The three of us are very close and supportive of one another, even though we have always lived in different states. We moved to Ontario, California, not far from Pomona, where both my older sister and I went to Chaffee Union High School. My parents divorced when I was a sophomore in high school. This was a very difficult time in my life, but I had wonderful friends in high school, many of whom are still friends today. I took a college preparatory course, and because of the first Russian satellite, Sputnik, I took physics in addition to chemistry. I went to Pasadena College, a private liberal arts college, where I majored in theology and science. At the time, I planned to do medical missionary work. I was most interested in laboratory sciences, but was also interested in nursing after I worked in the admitting office of St. Luke's Hospital in Pasadena while in college. My college did not have a nursing school at the time, so I went to Pasadena City College and an associate degree nursing program, in addition to simultaneously continuing with my baccalaureate program this last 2 years of college. I went to the Nazarene Theological Seminary, where I studied 2 years with a very influential professor, Dr. Paul Oriala, a psycholinguist, a cultural anthropologist, minister, musician, and well-known missionary to Haiti. He was a dynamic teacher, and I was able immediately to use his anthropological insights and skills to create changes in the emergency department and then in one of the first coronary care units in the county at Kansas City General Hospital. I met Richard Benner in 1966, and we married in August 1967. We immediately moved to Stanford University. My husband has been a constant colleague, debate partner, and intellectual soulmate since I met him in Kansas City. We have influenced each other's work, but Richard's award-winning dissertation on a situational and interpretive model of leadership had a profound influence on my understanding of practice and on all of my intellectual projects. I worked as a visiting nurse in San Jose area and then at Stanford University Hospital Intensive Care Unit. I then entered the master's program in nursing at the University of California, San Francisco in September 1969 and graduated in June 1970. UCSF was a wonderful opening of new studies and understandings for me. I remember that my mother was very surprised when I wore a black armband to protest the Vietnam War at my graduation. Influential were the teachings of Dr. Jean Quint Benolil on end-of-life care, Dr. Shirley Chater, Dr. Reba Tournier in education, Dr. June Bailey in education, and also Dr. Marlene Kramer and Dr. Helen Nam, who was the dean of UCSF at the time. I went to work for Dr. Marlene Kramer as an associate research nurse specialist in September of 1970. Our son John was born in December of 1973, and 8 years later, our daughter, Lindsay Caroline, was born in 1981. When our son was just 2 years old, I entered the doctoral program at University of California, Berkeley as a non-divisional student in the School of Education. I studied with Dr. Richard Lazarus, who was in the Ed Psych department, and joined his dynamic research team, the Berkeley Stress and Coping Project, in order to study stress and coping in a healthy, middle-aged community sample. I co-authored 2 papers with Dr. Richard Lazarus, and I worked closely with brilliant doctoral student colleagues, including Dr. Judith Rubel, Dr. Susan Folkman, and others in the Berkeley Stress and Coping Project, who really continue to be colleagues today. Dr. Judith Rubel has particularly been a close friend, colleague, and one with whom I have shared the hopes, dreams, and challenges of being mothers to our children. 2 years into my doctoral studies, I consulted with Dr. Lazarus about taking a mind-body philosophy course to further our account of mind-body relationships. This was a turning point in my intellectual development. I took a course on Kierkegaard taught by Dr. Hubert Dreyfus and his research assistant, Jane Rubin, now Dr. Jane Rubin. I also took courses from Dr. Dreyfus on Merleau-Ponty, a French thinker who advanced theory on the social sentient body, and on the interpretive phenomenology of Martin Heidegger. Heidegger's writing and thinking were extensively influenced by Kierkegaard, and it was Kierkegaard's notions of the relationally meaningful, constituted relationships between mind and body that influenced my work. During my doctoral studies, Dr. Charles Taylor, a longtime friend of Dr. Hubert Dreyfus, came to Berkeley to give lectures and classes 3 times, and his thinking became influential also. This was a very exciting time in the development of the human sciences. Michel Foucault came to Berkeley to meet and engage in dialogue about his philosophy and methods in the human sciences at this time. I graduated from UC Berkeley in June 1982 and began my work as an associate professor at UCSF at the end of June 1982. From Novice to Expert, Excellence and Power in Clinical Nursing Practice was published in 1984. Within the same thought project, in co-authorship with my doctoral colleague, Dr. Judith Rubel, Judith and I worked on and developed a reinterpretation of the Lazarus cognitive phenomenological transactional theory of stress and coping in a book entitled The Primacy of Caring, Stress and Coping in Health and Illness, that was then published in 1989. From Novice to Expert and The Primacy of Caring, we received American Journal of Nursing Book of the Year Award. These 2 books, along with my edited book, Interpretive Phenomenology, present a rather full picture of my articulation of nursing knowledge, skill, intents, and practice from an interpretive phenomenological perspective. My colleagues, Dr. Christine Tanner and Dr. Catherine Chesla, and I were funded by the Fold Foundation to study skill acquisition of new graduate nurses. This study was a continuation and extension of the earlier work from Novice to Expert. We published our findings in the book Expertise in Nursing Practice, Caring, Ethics, and Clinical Judgment in 1996. The next study, Clinical Wisdom and Interventions in Critical Care, with my colleagues Dr. Patricia Hooper-Kirakaides and Dr. Daphne Stannard, focused on advanced practice nurses as well as the original full sample of expert nurses to articulate the nature of clinical wisdom embedded in the practice of nurses in critical care units, in transport care, and in the emergency department. My current research, under the auspices of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, is a national study on the education of undergraduate nurses. My colleagues in this study are Dr. Molly Sutphin, Dr. Victoria Leonard-Kahn, Dr. Lisa Day, and support and consultation with senior Carnegie scholars, Dr. William Sullivan and Dr. Ann Colby, along with the wonderful guidance from Dr. Lee Schulman, president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. This work will be published early in 2009 by Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and Jossie Bass Publishers.
Dr. Martha Alligood met with Dr. Patricia Benner on University of California's San Francisco campus.
Patricia, I'm so pleased to be here with you today in San Francisco and to talk with you about your exciting work that you've accomplished over these years. And I know the viewers are going to be so pleased to hear about your work and to hear it in your own words.
Well, you're so welcome here at the University of California in San Francisco. And in fact, we're in the Anselm Strauss room out of the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences. So welcome to the school and to the department.
Patricia, I'd like for us to begin by talking about how your theoretical work all began. And maybe you could share with the viewers about that. And I think they'd be interested in if there were people, particular people, who had an influence in that beginning work.
Well, I think I was really strongly influenced by my learning from patients and from my experience as a nurse. But then when I was in my graduate school at UC Berkeley, I worked with Richard Lazarus in the Stress and Coping Project. And in the process of that wonderful study, we were studying people in the community rather than people who were ill. And we were studying 100 people who were middle-aged and a bit older. And we were interested in how they coped with the everyday stresses of life. And so that fit perfectly with the things that I was interested in. And of course, people would even be ill during the year as we studied them. And I asked Dick Lazarus, who became a very good friend and was a wonderful mentor, if I shouldn't go over to the philosophy department and take a mind-body philosophy class. And we were doing all kinds of transitions at the time, transitioning Dick's research from the laboratory to the community. And we were trying to develop this notion of a transactional view of stress, so that it was really a view of the person both setting up and constituting the situation and being constituted by that situation. So it was neither the person nor the environment alone, but the two in interaction. So I just, with very dumb luck, stumbled into Hubert Dreyfus's course on Kierkegaard, because of course Kierkegaard was a really wonderful mind-body philosopher. And it was life-changing for me. I suddenly had a new language to talk about the person in the situation, about relationships, self-defining relationships and concerns. And I also got a real sense of how we are known and come to know ourselves in relationship and in dialogue. So I, through studying Kierkegaard, I ended up going back and taking the Kierkegaard class another 5 times. But it was changing each time. The interpretation was growing, and I was so fortunate to have the mentorship of Dr. Bert Dreyfus and Jane Rubin, who was his teaching assistant. And I went on from that initial series of Kierkegaard classes to study Merleau-Ponty as taught by Hubert Dreyfus. And Merleau-Ponty is one of our, I think, the foremost philosophers and theorists on mind-body relationships. And also the courses on Heidegger, which were a wonderful deconstruction of the Cartesian view of the private subject standing over against and apart from an objective world. So this was all language that I needed to describe what's going on in these intimate caregiving relationships between nurses and patients. And over the years, really almost 30 years, I've had students go back and take Bert Dreyfus's courses. He's still teaching. And each time the students, some 48 of them, have said, well, I needed this language. This was something that was really useful to me and helped me articulate what I know and practice. And I find it very reassuring that my experience was replicated by those students. They didn't feel like I had shoved them into a class that was difficult that they didn't want to take. It was really very useful. And the students found it useful in some of the same ways and even different ways than I found it useful. I also felt really fortunate in my teaching in that my students could always take the philosophy firsthand from a really world-renowned philosopher, and even his colleagues, because Charles Taylor, his very close friend, came and taught at least 2 different years while I was at Berkeley, and I took courses from him on interpretation and the sciences of man or persons. And I really appreciate the fact that all of my students could follow and take coursework in the philosophy department, and then I would spend a great deal of time mentoring with them on how we understood this in relation to nursing.
I'm sure over the years that people come up and talk to you at conferences and so forth about your theory and your work. And I wonder if you've come up with a brief description that you might share with the viewers today.
Well, I wish I had a really quick, short, poetic answer to that, but of course, because I'm working in a philosophical tradition, my only innovation has been to take that into nursing and see what it sounds like, looks like, feels like from a nursing perspective and from the patient's perspective of experiencing illness, recovery, learning to cope and manage multiple chronic illnesses. So with that caveat, this philosophical approach has given me a way to study skill acquisition or coping at the very high end, and skills and coping in the midst of illness and suffering and struggle. So I'm always interested in studying the person in the situation, and the focus of the work is really on articulating the knowledge that's embedded in everyday practice, whether it be nursing practice, mothering practices, fathering, parenthood practices, or ethical comportment, ethical relationships, clinical imagination, clinical knowledge, skills, and habits and development. So I'm always very interested in practical knowledge, practical wisdom embedded in everyday life. And this view of practice is actually part of the theory, and that is to view practice as a way of knowing in its own right. Not that it's infallible, not that it doesn't need to be augmented or enriched by theory, but I think practice is a larger house than theory or science. And we need to study what we've learned experientially in practice in order to guide the science and the technology, which are located in the house of practice. So I don't have any sort of oppositional view of theory and practice, rather that the two are in dialogue with one another. And that isn't very succinct, and I apologize for that.
Well, now, but the focus is practice.
It's really a focus on habit, skill, knowledge embedded in practice, relational understanding, self-understanding, identity, ethical comportment formation, coping with illness, all of these things that are located in our everyday life worlds as compared to a more detached view of looking on the person outside the situation. My starting point is always looking at the person, studying the person in context, in the situation. And my view of knowledge within a practice is always that of situated knowledge.
Okay. Next, I'd like for us to talk about your theory with regard to education, practice, and research. And I'd also be interested in whether any one of those is more important in your mind than another.
Well, they all are important, and I have been so pleased and benefited from working with many wonderful colleagues in doing research in this tradition, this interpretive phenomenological position. And so I've worked with over 48 doctoral students, for example, and many postdoctoral students, and my colleagues also here at UCSF. And I can now really say that the research tradition in this in interpretive phenomenology has really grown. There are many studies now about stress and coping with illness, about ethical comportment, about ethical concerns. For example, Lisa Day did a study of the role of etiquette in ethical comportment in transplantation. So it's really opened up new ways of understanding many areas of nursing practice and many issues that patients and families face. There have been, thanks to the work of Kit Chesla and Vicki Leonard-Kahn and Lee Smith battle. There have been many studies on families. Lee Smith has studied teenage mothers and has actually, from her dissertation, followed these mothers for 16 years. So, and there are many studies internationally and nationally. So I think the research tradition has grown really well. And currently I'm collaborating with my husband and the Federal Nurses Group in Army, Navy, and Air Force to study experiential knowledge gained in Afghanistan and Iraq, because the healthcare delivery has changed phenomenally in this particular war. And so we're studying what the nurses have learned in the front line with this change in the healthcare delivery there.
So when you think of these areas, would you say that one of those is more important than the other?
I think practice is probably the highest impact area, because many hospitals, I've lost track of the number, have used, for example, the Novice to Expert and the Clinical Wisdom and the Expertise in Nursing book to develop clinical promotion programs, and even better, to develop projects of articulating knowledge embedded in their most expert practice or in breakdown situations. They've also used the Novice to Expert as a way to think about orienting new nurses and for mentoring them across the stages of skill acquisition. So accrediting bodies have used it, and in Australia they do things in a very big organized ways, and so whole provinces have used it as a way of granting clinical promotions. I'm very pleased with the fact that we now have many clinical promotion programs, and so the only way to advance in practice salary-wise is no longer to go into administration or and of course now nurse educators don't make as much as clinicians, so maybe that's a little bit a problem. But I think it has had an impact on the growth of practice knowledge and paying attention to what nurses know in their practice. And education, a number of schools have used particularly primacy of caring as a curricular integration tool. And I was pleased at Harvard, they used, I don't know if they still do, but they used at one time primacy of caring in the Harvard Medical School and also at UCLA. So these, there has been an impact on education, but currently I'm involved in a national study conducted by the Carnegie Foundation for Advancement in Teaching, and we are examining undergraduate nursing education, and of course I bring with me some of my perspectives into that study, but we've done a really open-ended qualitative study of nursing education practices. You might be interested to know that in each of these is that Carnegie has done a series of studies of professions: engineers, clergy, law, medicine, and nursing. And the sort of ethical vision behind all of this is to come up with a broader civic professionalism rather than the narrow sort of Talcott-Parsons model of narrow rational technicality. And so we've had the opportunity to do dialogue with the other professions as we've studied nursing education. So I think in terms of pedagogies, I think you might be interested to know that the pedagogy most common in nursing education is that of really situated coaching, which makes total sense to me because practice is always situated action in knowledge and skill. And nurse educators typically are excellent coaches in the clinical situation. And so I think this work might have more influence on education as time goes by, but I would say that's the least point of influence at this point.
Patricia, I'm sure that many contributions have been made to nursing knowledge through your work. But would you discuss that a little bit yourself? What contribution do you see, and do you consider this theoretical work your major contribution?
Well, I think I've never done anything more significant than my actual nursing practice and care of patients. I think that's amazingly complex and compelling work. I have drawn all of my theoretical insights, or my articulations, really a better way of putting it, insights directly from the practice of expert nurses. I do think that introduction of the use of narrative as a way of capturing historical clinical reasoning and as a way of capturing the perception of nurses has made a real contribution in clinical knowledge development in practice. We've done, and this I say we with my husband, have done a large number of projects with hospitals, Massachusetts General, Beth Israel in Boston, Children's Hospital at Yale, of going in and helping nurses write first-person experience-near narratives. And the thing about this is not a deficit approach. You can give, nor is it a heroic approach. You can give a clinical situation where everything went wrong. It was real breakdown. And in studying that narrative, you can see what were the failed areas of practice, what were the failed notions of good. And here I'm not talking about personal failures, I'm just saying how it didn't come together. And you also learned a tremendous amount from asking nurses to write clinical narratives about a situation where they learned something new, or a situation that they thought was really the quintessence of their practice. And then we really, really pour over those narratives and don't exit them into stages of skill acquisition or anything else, but rather look at the notions of good that were embedded in the narrative, the areas of knowledge and skill, and all the in order to and for sake of the significance of that nursing care, and begin to really give public language to that so that you can take the experiential learning of a nurse and make it accessible, and therefore make it more collective and cumulative so it can grow over time. And that's been a very satisfying area of work in nursing practice for me, is really introducing the way narrative can help people. And there's a particular way that narrative is used, and that's the only instruction ever is first person. This comes from Clifford Geertz's work in anthropology, but it's a first person experience near account of a clinical situation. And I prefer it orally rather than written, although I have had people write them. But oral telling is better because it can be more circular. Oh, I forgot to tell you this. Oh, besides, this other thing was going on. And so you get more of the information about the context and perception. And it is possible to identify the knowledge and skill areas that the nurse is struggling with, the notions of good they're struggling with in their practice, in this practice situation.
Patricia, is there a particular narrative that would illustrate what you're describing?
Yes, I'm thinking of this one story that still grips me. And this ICU nurse was working with a patient, older man, whose father was a physician, and the patient came in, and the son who was a physician, demanding everything be done. And so there were like millions and millions, I'm exaggerating, orders all at once, and he was in terrible respiratory distress. And so she was starting, and the blood pressure, vital signs were not good. He was very unstable. So she was starting all the drips. She was assisting with the intubation and helping with the respiration. And but meanwhile, this man is in horrible pain, and she's so caught up And she couldn't get the team, the resident team was in there, but she couldn't get any of them to attend to the pain management at the time. So she really needed an attendant or someone more experienced. And she tells this story. She was at least comforting him, but she felt so sad that she didn't call in her nursing colleagues. Hindsight, it's always 20/20. That she didn't call for help and that she didn't effectively convey. And she said, but I learned a lot out of this. Next time I will call my nursing colleagues in and I'll get them to take my place and I'll go talk to the attending because I have a better firsthand grasp of the situation. So I love those kinds of narratives where you're really learning a lot from the situation because, as we all know, those clinical situations are very complex, fast-moving, and underdetermined. We live them forward, we understand them backward quite often. So that story stands out for me. Some people think that we're only looking at heroic stories, and if you really read the stories that are in Clinical Wisdom or Expertise in Nursing Practice or Novice to Expert, they really aren't heroic stories. They're situated stories of knowledge and skill and relationship, but they may be accounts of situations when everything went wrong. And that's the other lovely thing about narratives, is that you can talk about what was possible given the fact that there was only one LVN on the floor with you at the time, or there was, the physician had gone out for a jog and had his earphones on and you couldn't reach him, or whatever these wild and bizarre circumstances are, you can include it in the narrative. And so one of the rules of interpreting narratives is, not to fold your arms and say, well, what if you had done, but rather look squarely at the limitations and the boundedness of that situation and what were the resources, constraints, and limitations of the situation, because our work is always situated like that in very complex, underdetermined clinical situations.
So then the work that you did originally for Novice to Expert forms a basis for all this other work.
It does, but it's in concert with that work on stress and coping and the primacy of caring, to understand the nature of the life world and the lived experience, and not always split the person off from that, to keep the person in the situation, whether you're studying coping or knowledge and skill embedded in practice or whatever you're studying, is to keep that together and keep that embedded. And you wanted to know what you think, what influence my work has had, or what do I think is my major contribution. I think it might be too soon to tell that. I don't really know. But I think that this work has given language for nurses as knowledge workers, and a new level of understanding of the nature of practice itself, that practice isn't a mere sort of technical stamping out of a theory, but rather a dialogical relationship with theory, and an arena where new knowledge is developed every day experientially. And it's also an area where there's a lot of local specific clinical knowledge that we need to capture and articulate in order to make our clinical science grow.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really interesting.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful being here and talking with you today. As we close this interview, I wonder if there's anything else you'd like to share with the viewers.
Thank you very much. And I suppose it would be appropriate to close by saying that every nurse in practice has an incredible vantage point on the human condition, on the value of connection and care, and is in a great position to articulate what they learn experientially from their practice.
It's been wonderful being here with you today and talking with you, visiting with you. But hearing about your work and hearing it from you has been very special for me, and I know it will be for our viewers. I want to thank you, Patricia, for agreeing to do this interview.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I've enjoyed the discussion. My 48 doctoral students at UCSF and 20 dissertation advisees from other universities and many postdoctoral students and international scholars have also advised me well and taught me much. They have profoundly influenced the development of this work and extended it in many new directions. I believe that it is now a growing tradition and is influencing practice and education.